Ravi, you're co-host, so you can certainly unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sure. Very
Good.
nice.
Loud, or I should make it louder?
Oh, just seems perfect.
Good, good.
So you're
Um,
going to
we
introduce
have we
this?
have power. Fortunately, we have power. So in case I need to share, I can share also her screen. But you are already sharing, or is it mine?
I'm sharing.
Good, good. Kindly keep it that way, because in case 99% our power will not go. It hasn't gone for a week, but you never know. I have a battery backup, but I haven't installed it, where I can have one light bulb and a fan and a computer on that. But it hasn't happened in last 1 week. 2 weeks ago it happened. So I would request you to get her going, or get me going, and then I have copied your introduction from the email, so I can read it. Uh,
Okay.
I'll just have a couple of things in context of what I worked with her, which I thought I put it on the website, I thought, or at least I told last time. So I can repeat a little bit of how I know her. That's all. But just 30 seconds. Then her introduction. She has been our speaker for many, many sessions. I have not collected that statistics, but I think many people who are regulars, they know that she has been on our forum a few times.
Oh, yeah, she's very active
Yeah. And she certainly posts a lot.
and posts. Yeah. So yeah, I've been at a number of meetings where she was at the meeting too.
Yes,
Goes
yes,
back pretty far in my case.
yes,
She was active in the ODM.
yes.
You might not know it, but the ODM was started as a result of my paper.
She's already asking us if we should, if she wants us to join us now, so I can say yes. We are online.
So anyway,
Yes.
whenever
I would request you to give a minute or something, introduce her if you like, and then I
oh no
can
no
follow it up. Or,
you're the host, you should
uh,
introduce her.
okay, all right.
I'll just pass the baton to you.
Thank you, sir. And then one of these days we need to talk to each other too. Maybe, maybe this week or early next week. Whatever is suitable to you, I will call you.
Yeah, I think yeah. So people are showing up.
Oh, John is showing. Good.
John is here.
Elisa is
Alex.
showing. Elisa is on board. We can tell her on the web. Elisa, you can probably unmute yourself and start video whenever you are ready. Temporarily, I have requested Ken to share your slides on the screen, but if you like to share them yourself, let us know.
Okay, good. And can I show my, oh, good. Okay. I'm
can
happy
take,
to
you can
drive my
share,
slides, actually.
you
Welcome.
can share. Go ahead.
All right, very good. Let me,
Ken is speaking to you, Elisa.
I heard. Got it.
Good.
And so let me share my screen.
Yes, please. Welcome.
Very nice. And then I will do slideshow. Okay. So are you ready for
Oh,
me to start?
we are going to start as soon as Ken is ready. He's going to start the session, say a couple of words about you, then I will read the intro as we sent to everyone in the email.
Okay, excellent.
Hey, welcome everyone to the Ontology Summit 2025. Today is the 23rd of April, 2025, and we are thrilled to welcome Lisa Kendall to speak to us today. And the host of our meeting is Ravi Sharma. And I will pass it on to Ravi, who will give you a more proper introduction.
Thank
Ravi,
you
go
very
ahead.
much, Ken. Ken, thank you and welcome to Elisa. Elisa, before I start introducing to you, I'm aware that both you and Mike Bennett are closely associated with OMG, and OMG has recently lost its managing director, Dr. Richard Sole, who was also a good mentor, good encouraging person for my career as well. And I miss him, and this is our small tribute to his wisdom that he got the OMG accelerated to newer dimensions, including bringing people like you on board. So, just as we have paid tribute to our founder, Mr. Peter Yim, and then we have missed some great speakers like Doug Lennett and our colleague Matthew West. We are welcoming you now from that OMG background that I just started with a tribute to these people. But you have guided me personally in professional work at OMG for ODM, latter part, a little bit in the beginning, and up to BPMN2 kind of level of UML2, and then SBVR, and time and calendar efforts in which you were also involved. So, this is my personal interaction with you as a professional and as a physicist. And I want everybody to know that that is beside the bio that Ken has kindly put together and sent you all in the Ontolog Forum email announcing Elisa's session with us today. She has worked at DARPA, at DoD, NASA JPL, as consultant, as in many capacities at SRI, and she has obviously built a lot of capability in OMG and including ODM, main one, and lot of those ISO standards, W3C OWL, and best practices working groups. She's applying ontology in some commercial applications like travel, agriculture, chemical engineering, and she's developing two big ontologies that she will talk to us about, including FIBO and chemical areas, pharmaceutical areas. So, without keeping too much distance between me and the speaker and all of you, we welcome Melissa. We clap with both our hands and we start you on your journey to deliver us your wisdom and learning. Thank you.
Ravi, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And we do go back decades, and the work that we've done at OMG in particular, I'm very proud of, especially some recent things that I will talk about today. I was on the OWL Language Working Committee, although one could argue that I had more of a peripheral role. So one of the documents for the OWL2 standard that you might recognize that I worked on is the quick reference guide, and mainly because the other documents were so complicated and distributed and discombobulated that for the people that I was working with, I needed a way to say, hey, here we've collected the main things you need to know about any of these constructs, and you can click on the link and go there. And so that's probably the biggest legacy of mine from the W3C OWL working group. But I have spent a lot of time at OMG. I'm on the board of directors. I'm on the architecture board. Richard Soley asked me to join the board of directors many years ago when he recognized there were very few women on the board, and he was trying to help diversify. And so I was grateful for his leadership. He always had a minute for me. He was a brilliant guy, the best front man for an organization like a standards body that you could possibly ask for. And I miss him dearly. So in that sense, Ravi, I just had you shared in advance you were going to say that, I would have grabbed a photo, because I have a few of him. One of them when Deb McGinnis and I wrote our book, which we are now updating finally. We met with Richard, and he did a book giveaway at an OMG meeting. And so I have even photos of that, but somewhere. But really appreciate that introduction. And with that, I understand that the summit this year has been focused on large data sets and things like that. And so Ravi asked me if I would talk to you all about developing the kinds of ontologies that can support really large and diverse data sets. And so that is what we're about today. And I'll try to get through the slides quickly enough so that we can have some conversation at the end. And I don't have a hard stop, Ravi, so I can stay on a little bit long if people have questions and we don't get through them in the hour. So for those of you who don't know the EDM Council, who I support part-time, it's a data management and governance organization. There are lots and lots of member companies, as well as professionals that are individual members. The council is primarily known for some of their frameworks. So DCAM, which is a data management assessment tool. Similarly, the cloud data management assessment tool that sits out there and that many companies are implementing. There is work going on in research and benchmarking. The council works with a number of regulators who use our frameworks to extend them to support government activities. There's a lot of training around those kinds of frameworks and some certification capability if you're interested in that. They offer a number of networking opportunities, and I support the box front and center in the middle around standards and industry models and standard ontologies for various industries, so industry verticals mainly. So the lab, which is the part of the organization that I've been participating in, is actually in the process of being folded into the main organization because it's becoming so central to the work that the EDM Council does. And the whole idea is that in order to build out large ontologies that can support the kinds of projects that we're talking about today, you really need a whole framework for collaboration. And so over the last 10, 12 years, driven by Dennis Wisnowski, actually, we have a framework that we've set up for collaborative ontology development that allows us to do work 24/7. And I will be talking about that in a few minutes. But a number of our projects use this framework, which includes FIBO, the pharmaceutical ontology that Ravi mentioned, called IDMPO, which stands for Identification of Medicinal Products. For manufacturing, the NIST and now OAGI, Industrial Ontologies Foundries, leverages the same infrastructure. And there are other projects ongoing and emerging that are also using that infrastructure for collaborative development, mainly for pre-competitive, vendor-agnostic ontology development to support standards. So the pre-competitive thing is really important because oftentimes when organizations like pharma companies get together to do something, governments around the world figure they're colluding and doing price fixing. And so that is not what we're about. And so we need to emphasize the fact that this is standards work, and it's pre-competitive, and it is agnostic to the vendors who might implement it, and it's always open source. So the whole idea is to reduce cost and implementation challenges, improve adoption, reduce the development time that, in this case, pharma companies, in FIBO case, financial organizations, including the regulators, need to put in order to duplicate the same ontologies over and over again, specifically for regulatory compliance kinds of applications. Okay, so other things that the lab is involved in, we have a number of initiatives in emerging technologies, machine learning, digitization of assets, not limited to financial assets, including things like one project for working with digital commodity units, which are measured in order to determine whether or not some very, very large company is reducing their emissions, for example, if they've been given a large loan whose terms depend on those reductions. There's some quantum computing research going on I haven't been involved in, and then sustainability. So again, sustainability and asset digitization seem to be going together more and more often. And so we've been working with a couple of organizations that are involved in that. One recent addition to FIBO, in fact, was for sustainability-linked lending, for green lending, and transition loans. And the litmus test is a ginormous loan to Occidental Petroleum, which is actually available in their SEC filings, which is about upgrading some of their refineries in Mombasa. And so that one is really, really interesting because it's so large. It's in the trillions of dollars. And so we figured if we can represent that, we can represent anything. So that was the use case there. And so building these kinds of ontologies that are cross-organizational and that are developed in order to address large data challenges. There are a lot of preconditions that we've learned over the years. One of them is people need to want to work together. And in order to make that happen, they all need to agree on the objectives of the project. We need to establish priorities, especially across companies, which has been a key both barrier and win on our pharma project, and then set objectives that you can address in a reasonable amount of time. And then you also need to have some set of rules of engagement. So everybody has to agree on the IRI policy. Everybody has to agree on what metadata we're going to use. Everybody has to agree on certain naming conventions so that the product that we end up with at the end of the day is cohesive, coherent, and consistent internally. And so another challenge has been agreeing on which use cases are the highest priority, what competency questions every sprint is going to address, and continuous testing with every update that people want to do across the board with the same examples and reference data using the same rules so that we can ensure that as the ontology evolves, it continues to address the problems it was originally designed to address, and that we haven't broken anything. So with that, we can commit to our sponsors and to users more broadly that what we're doing works and we haven't broken anything that they depend on. And so those are some of our rules of engagement. And in order to do that and to work at that level, the work has to be sponsored. You have to have somebody paying for it. And that includes paying for hosting all of the tools that we use, which don't come for free, and paying for the work, and thus enabling us to prioritize certain use cases over others. And so these are kind of the preconditions to success for setting up a product or ontology effort that have been important for us to progress at the EDM Council. And Ken or Ravi, jump in if there's a question in the chat that you think I should pause and answer. Another insight is that doing this kind of work requires a lot of rigor. And you have to have a team that's both knowledgeable and works well and with and engages subject matter experts from multiple organizations in order to get the best view of what it is that you need to add to the ontology and why. And so for the purposes of our IDMP project, for FIBO and for others, what you have is a combination of these subject matter experts and seasoned ontologists that are working with others. And, for example, on IDMP, I am not the only ontologist. There are 3 others from 3 different companies that are participating, and there may be more as we go forward. So, and we also have ontologists that are internal to each of the pharma companies that are participating. And they, in turn, are beholden to their subject matter experts. But also when we have questions on the more core development team, we can ask them to reach back, or we can ask them to bring those folks to the table to answer some of those questions. And then our team is, and I have another slide about IDMPO coming up, is not just the ontologist, not just the stakeholders, but a number of folks that follow behind me that implement the queries that are designed to support the competency questions. They map the data to both reference data and internally feet on the ground at the pharma companies to make sure that it all works. And they support documentation. And so that piece is critical, and it's a much bigger piece of the challenge than just the front end ontology work. And then finally, we have project management that keep things on track. So for IDMP, we have core team meetings every other week that include the pharma stakeholders. We have weekly terminology meetings. We have weekly use case meetings, and we have every 6 weeks what's called a community of interest meeting, where we invite folks from the broader community to come and hear about what we're doing, learn about some of the more recent use cases implemented at the pharma companies, and so forth. And so for pharma, and actually for finance to date, most of our use cases are organized around compliance and regulatory reporting. We have some that are strictly for interoperability and data sharing, but the lion's share of our use cases involve compliance in some way or another. And then there's research. So front end, more early stage pharma development with respect to IDMPO that talks a little bit about what it means to track the content very, very early in the process before you have authorization from a medicines agency. Okay. And beyond that, what we're doing at the EDM Council and working with OMG is in standardization of these things, right? So there's even another level of rigor that might not be needed if you're building an application ontology or an enterprise level ontology at a company. And it might not even be important for some organizational purposes. But for standardization, you really need the mandate from the corporate higher ups. They need to pay to be members of the standards bodies that are involved. That gives them the opportunity to have a voice and a vote, but it also means funding. And they also have to commit to giving us the access to subject matter experts and the resources to do the work as a critical part of their jobs. And that's been hard with respect to FIBO because not everybody mandated it initially, although with the Financial Data Transparency Act, more of that is bubbling up. For IDMP, it's been the case at the outset. So the subject matter experts at the various pharma companies are participating in the ISO standards work, and they recognize that the standards themselves are ambiguous. So stay tuned and I'll talk a little more about that. So this slide and a couple of these come from a colleague on the IDMP project, Sheila Els at Bayer. And these are some of the kinds of use cases that they have for pharma, for integration, for the ontology. So they want to be able to use this set of ontologies for uniquely identifying medicinal products up and down their development life cycle, ranging from indications in clinical trials to patient safety to things that happen way downstream, including shortage monitoring, and also cross-border prescriptions, because that's a big deal, especially in the case of natural disasters. We're seeing more and more of those, and you've got people who have been displaced, who don't have their blood pressure meds, who don't have the sort of basics that they need in order to survive. And so organizations like Doctors Without Borders send people into those areas to help with prescriptions and things like that. But in order to do that, you need to understand whether or not what you have in hand on the ship that you're sleeping on is the same prescription as what some person in a country that is completely around the world from yours, written in a language you don't read, is the same. And that is hard. And so that's one of the uses of the ontology that we're working on. So the whole effort was designed to support and be a companion to these global standards about identifying medicinal products, about dose forms, about the substances involved in those products. Over the course of the project, we have had some 12 plus paying sponsors who really want this badly. Currently, we are working with Amgen, Merck, and Boehringer Ingelheim in follow-up extensions, but everyone else has still been on board for the duration. And it's very, very cool to see that. There are implementation partners. We have a new implementation partner starting this year. Rather than PharmaLex, we're starting to work with a company called Crown Point. And so they are going to be doing some of the work that PharmaLex did in prior years, and also helping us map to other ontologies that they are developing for the Pistoia Alliance. Pistoia is a pharma industry consortium, and they are the source of funding for this work. And on the left, you can see some of the different ISO standards that are involved. The main two standards are the substance and medicinal product standard. The other one, the pharmaceutical product standard, it's kind of a subset of medicinal products. And The dose forms also duplicate some information that's in the other standards. The challenge there is, of course, the definitions in these standards are not identical. The diagrams that they use as data models don't name any of the lines. And I can go on for days about some of the challenges with the standards and why the pharma companies felt they needed an ontology in order to provide the semantics over those 5 standards. So the project started out in 2021. We did kind of a phase 1 minimal viable product in 2022. We continued build out to provide production level coverage in 2023. Last year, we started focusing more and more on implementation, and we now have pretty decent coverage of the main standards, and also the competency questions to test for the content across the standards and with respect to other concerns related to implementation for regulatory compliance that the pharma companies have brought to the table. And some of those are listed here. This is kind of the project overview. This is from a couple of years ago, because I guess this was last year. I don't have an update for 2025, but the core team of supporters included AbbVie, Amgen, who are very active, AstraZeneca, Bayer, Boehringer Ingelheim, Novartis, and this year Merck has joined that core team, and I think a couple of the companies have dropped off, but we're hoping to bring them back. And so we have a pipeline for implementation. The EDM Council supports governance and hosting, including the collaboration framework I mentioned. We lead the ontology effort with help from PharmaLex to date, but now it will be CrownPoint. And then from an implementation side and demo support, an organization called Accurids, and they and CrownPoint will be providing the pipeline of problems and questions and implementation issues that come up with our pharma partners. And I mentioned the community of interest calls. We do those regularly. There are project leads from the various organizations and champions, including Sheila Ells from Bayer, and a number of players from the regulatory agencies, as well as other organizations are starting to take notice. The regulators participate in my weekly meetings, looking at the terminology and the semantics and what they mean and why it maps to something different in the EU than it maps to in the US. And then the FDA and European Medicines Agency folks start, talking at each other as opposed to working on the semantics with me, but it's always interesting. Okay, so here's an example. We've had various use cases that touch on different parts of the standards with respect to what concepts are needed from which standard in order to answer the competency questions. You can see here for the top 3 for substance identification and the roles of those substances in various medicines, for certain kinds of reporting, and for deeper investigation into therapeutic indications. You'll see sort of the color-coded dots on the diagram from one of the standards that says what it is that we're using from that standard in order to answer those questions. The color-coded diagram itself is just what's in the standard. They sort of blocked out different topic areas, but has no semantic meaning. And so the sponsors have all contributed use cases. And so AbbVie has an IDMP-based data extractor internally, and this kind of talks about some of the pieces of that puzzle. And these are in the PDF I sent to Ravi for posting, and I think there's a way to step through this to see them. Amgen is working on a project related to Customer 360 that they use internally. And they have other use cases as well related to supply chain that we're working on for this year. For AstraZeneca, it was all about creating a reference architecture and a data mesh using the IDMP ontology and others as the basis for that work. For Bayer, it's all about linking into their manufacturing systems, including SAP and their RIM system, which is for regulatory reporting, mapping the concepts in the IDMP ontology to those elements in their backend system so they can answer questions they could not answer before. One of those, which was really important, is, in which manufactured item is this particular substance used? And typically, they need to answer those kinds of questions when the regulators come and ask, because in some cases, not just at Bayer, but at other companies, some substance that's been reformulated will cause side effects for patients that are less than good. So in order to address those questions quickly, it used to take them several months to answer the question in which manufactured item is some substance used around the world at all of their manufacturing facilities. And what they determined in this case was that the substance was used in the packaging for one batch of one product because of supply chain issues. And that particular case, it caused somebody to become ill, and therefore they needed to figure out where else that substance might have been used. And as it happens, it was only from one manufacturing facility and in a limited number of batches, and only because of the supply chain challenge. And it wasn't used in the drug itself, it was in the packaging, and it leached into the drug from the packaging. So if you can imagine a company the size of Bayer that distributes things like aspirin around the world and manufactures it around the world, it took several months to answer the question, and now they can do it in seconds. A couple of other use cases. So this is from Boehringer Ingelheim. They've created a series of knowledge graphs. They link both public data and data from the regulators and their internal data to the ontology, and they're using this in their manufacturing pipeline today. Who was this? Oh, I think this was GSK. They're building out a supply chain ontology and using the IDMP ontology as the basis for that. And it crosses over many of their internal systems, although it turns out that most of the pharma companies use the same ones. They may not configure them the same way, however. At Johnson & Johnson, they're doing a master product portfolio. And so here's a concept map that maps to our ontology. At Merck, they were building out their own internal unique identifier for the substances used across the company, and a single view internally so that they can map out to all of their manufacturing systems. For Novartis, they were working on a challenge related to falsified medicines reporting and counterfeit medicines reporting when those were identified. This one is Pfizer, and they were working on digital assets for regulatory reporting, which we are working on this year, and so on and so forth. And then the regulatory partners are also doing some testing, and the European Medicines Agency is now using the IDMPO ontology internally for their product management system. We've had involvement from the World Health Organization, from HL7, from others as well. And now I'm going to switch to finance. And the challenge in finance, and this is also true actually at some of the pharma companies, ranged from data fragmentation and silos, especially after 2008-9, when some of the larger banks subsumed other banks that had run into problems. There were a number of regulations that were promoted worldwide, but mainly in the US and the EU, to try to address issues related to lack of governance and data standards and inconsistent definitions and so forth. And the challenge is the banks are still not compliant. Some of them are partially compliant. And now the European Central Bank is fining people for not doing the right thing. And so from 2023, for example, there's a link to an article about the ECB putting out a little more of a hard-nosed line on people delivering on implementation because they weren't doing it. And the whole idea for FIBO has always been a linking data despite the silos, implementing an open reusable data standard, consistent and unambiguous definitions, very expressive schema that allows people to add on when they need to. We have a mechanism now using some work we've done at the OMG for a very nice representation of controlled vocabularies that maps to SCOS Excel. And we've learned that if our ontologies include patterns that are recognizable by some of the machine learning algorithms and natural language processing, that the more that we can repeat the same pattern for various kinds of concept definitions, the more likely we are to be more efficient for use of machine learning and more accurate in question answering, and that we can support, in some cases, limiting the hallucinations that people get from using large language models. And so there's a lot of research going on now using FIBO for that purpose. The financial industry business ontology has been around for many years. I think Mike Bennett and Mike Apkin started that work roughly 2007. And it has morphed a lot since then. It was originally a spreadsheet of terms. It became a UML model. It was converted to OWL in 2013. And I took over the work roughly as lead ontologist in the 2018-2019 timeframe. And Mike, as some of you know, is now technical director at the object management group. The idea is to take content from various standards, from regulatory requirements, from de facto standards like the Actus cash flow terminology, and from subject matter experts to build out something that is highly reusable across the industry. And it's consistent, and it's a framework for defining the terms, the legal entities, the counterparties, the master data for securities primarily is our focus, for any kind of instrument that people might want to promote or sell and that you find in the marketplace. And we're extending in different directions, as I mentioned earlier, including ESG for sustainability and that kind of thing. And in extensions for private equity, private credit, extensions for things that mid-level banks care about, and so forth. But one of the biggest use cases for FIBO is counterparty relations. And there's also the NIST IOF. Those of you who know Jim Logan and other folks at the OAGI and NIST who've been working on this for a number of years, we provide the infrastructure support for that development as well. And so there are some common requirements. I'm going to try to jump through these pretty quickly so that we can get to questions. They include, overlapping and evolving subdomains and highly distributed teams. And so we need continuous integration to maintain the synchronicity across the folks that are working on things. So the development methodologies have to be more rigorous and they require more automation. And you have to express your policies and procedures up front rather than, kind of having them evolve over the course of the development effort. So one of the lessons learned with respect to FIBO is that there was only really one main competency question or one main use case from the outset, which was, can we represent securities master data? But even that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And so not having use cases and competency questions from the start, which we do now, made it challenging in some cases, and we had to do some rework. And we're still doing a little bit of rework and retrofitting, but it's a lot less now than it was a few years ago. And so some of the policies we've established, policies for IRI structure and format, naming and labeling, metadata usage. The IOF has done something similar based on some of our recommendations and those of other players on the team. For IDMP and FIBO, common modeling patterns for rapid development and also for consistency. We also have automated quality assurance, as I mentioned, and processes for release management and versioning so that our community of users always knows what to expect and can take advantage of that. We maintain every version going back to roughly 2017 in what I call our Wayback Machine, so that people can compare any version that they might have downloaded and have been using with the updates coming forward and understand what the differences are and can decide if they're going to move forward. Many of our banks that are members and using FIBO have production systems that they've developed that use a particular version of FIBO, and then they download whatever we produce on our quarterly releases and decide when they are ready to replace what they have with the new version. But it's really important not to disenfranchise our user community by maintaining all of those versions and letting them see what we've done. And we have reviews internally for maintaining the release process properly. We have guidelines for how to do that and to manage feedback and address issues. We get feedback in terms of Jira issues. We also get feedback in terms of GitHub issues from our user community. And so we need to make sure those are all connected so that we can put the right issues into the right sprint. And then we have publication capabilities that allow the stakeholders to review our definitions and the structure without having to use Protege or other ontology tools. So that's important as well for engaging the subject matter experts. I mentioned increasing use of patterns. Some of those patterns have been used for years in FIBO, and we've lifted them out, standardized them at the OMG, and then retrofitted FIBO with the OMG versions that are, even more rigorously defined than what we had originally in FIBO. And we've tested with millions of records at member institutions, especially for counterparty exposure and risk, to improve the efficiency of our mappings and patterns and to link it to the source data and use it for query analysis. And so we've been increasingly adding to the OMG standard with the library of smaller pattern ontologies that are freely available to any of you that want to download them. And limiting the ad hoc stuff that was in FIBO originally has led to it being much more efficient for use in machine learning applications and other things like that. And we were able to lift those patterns for the IDMP in an entirely different domain. And at this point, more than half of the classes are taken from those patterns, and over 65% of the relationships and attributes also from those standards. We have a couple that we're planning to add to the library, but the lion's share of the work in building out that library is done. We think for now, the patterns are part of the Commons Ontology Library version 1.2 that is available from OMG. And so you can see the link here. We also have a pattern that we're updating in the next few months for representing controlled vocabularies. There are many in pharma, there are many in finance, And so having a way of representing those consistently and mapping them to one another has been key for us. And we believe that reuse of the libraries saved us over a year in development of the IDMP ontology. And our pharma members recognize those patterns and they've mapped them to their internal systems. The regulators are using some of them, including the controlled vocabulary pattern. FDA has been talking about that. EMA is already doing it. And that gives you solid building blocks for any other domain ontology that you can use consistently for machine learning, natural language processing, custom and large language models, and so forth. So a little bit more about our development approach for FIBO and these other projects, leveraging the EDM Council's infrastructure. Each of the projects has several working groups. Each of them are focused on different domain areas. That's also true of IOF. The teams need to include subject matter experts, business analysts that have domain knowledge as well as knowledge of their internal IT systems, regulators, other technical folks from some of the companies that are using our tools. They all participate in these calls. And the work's organized primarily by use case for each working group, but we can do ad hoc bug fixes as needed. We use Confluence for meeting minutes, and if there are issues to work off, we add those to Jira. And if somebody uploads an issue in GitHub, we cross-reference those, and we post all of our documentation to our wiki, and team members work offline on the issues, present revisions, and we action them in GitHub, but it takes 2 approvals for anything to be merged, sometimes more. So here's kind of that automation environment so that you can look at this at your leisure. We have weekly team meetings. The lead ontologist organizes those meetings for that domain area. We discuss the Jira issues, suggest changes, review those in those meetings. When we're finally ready, we push the changes to GitHub, and then we run that through this entire infrastructure, which includes the relevant competency questions, as well as a bunch of tests for quality control on the ontologies we built out. That happens with every pull request. And then once we think we're done, then it requires approvals by a peer or more than one peer, depending on the project, both ontologists and subject matter experts, in order to actually merge the change. And so all of that is managed automatically. The software behind all of this is also open source and it's available from the EDM Council GitHub. So you can see what it does. And I have a few slides with links for the supporting tools in FIBO. I won't go through this ad nauseum. One of them that's really important, though, for use of GitHub is our serializer, which makes sure that we serialize the ontology the same way every time. Protege moves stuff around. It adds a default IRI. It does other things to you that are not great, but a lot of people use it. So we reserialize the ontology so that you can actually compare line by line what changed in GitHub. And that's really important. It's open source. You're welcome to download it. And then everything has to follow our policies, which are listed there. And once we have 2 reviewers approved, then we merge everything, and you can change the number of users depending on the project. It's all configurable. And then we publish releases quarterly, including release notes. And we have variations per project. So for example, there are roughly 50 questions that we run, tests that we run for FIBO, roughly 50 for IDMPO, but there are maybe 8 to 10 of those that don't overlap. So the project can make some determination about what they want to test for. And for the IOF, that includes the first order axiomatization of some of the logic in addition to OWL. And for IDMP, we do regression testing against the European Medicines Agency and FDA data sources to make sure that our transformations still work. and everything's open source. So the locations of that are here. And if you want to look more deeply into the visualization tool we have, there are some instructions on something you can look at, which I will show next, down here at the bottom bullet. So the viewer is searchable online. It lets you look at so the list of ontologies is on the left. You can choose, put a term in or look for a specific ontology. This term, home equity line of credit, is in one of our ontologies. And if I want to see how to get to that, we have either a tree view or list view that can give you the class hierarchy that gets to that particular element. And in this case, it is multiply classified. So it's a secured consumer loan. It's a secured loan, it's a consumer loan, it's a collateralized loan, and so forth. It's also a revolving line of credit. So you can see there's a hierarchy there for how we classify certain things. And even though this is eye candy and not readable, we also have the ability to start on the far left where that dot is with the concept home equity line of credit and expand out all of the relationships to the ranges of those relationships, including the restrictions. And then you can expand from there, and it's very customizable. I like this tree view, but there's a whole bunch of different ways you can slice and dice and look at it. And you can easily take those images, close the view options, and use them in PowerPoint or whatever other documentation that you want to provide. So one other feature that I really love is this comparison feature. So the current version of this description of the class for home equity line of credit, some of it is added. And so the things that are lined out from the 2024 Q3 version are deleted because we moved them to other annotations. Or there are things that were in the prior version that we removed, and we removed a restriction related to collateralization because we then made home equity line of credit a subclass of being a collateralized loan, and they got that for free. So there are changes in both directions, and we can highlight what they were, and that helps our reviewers be able to look and see what happened without having to look at it in Protege and guess. So some lessons learned. A lot of productivity gains that took time to realize, but that's accelerated as the number of projects has increased. We have increasing parameterization of the tests that are mainly Sparkle query based, but not all, especially for the regression testing over examples and reference data. There's a lot more variability in our requirements as we move forward and as the projects morph and change. And so we needed more flexibility, which we've built in. And then we're always looking for feedback to improve things. So all of that is there. Project structure and sponsorship has been key to the success for the Pistoia project, in particular for IDMPO. Partnering with people that can provide feet on the ground, so other consultants that go into the pharma companies to make sure everything is working. That's also been critical for us. And then adding capabilities to the test harness that's in progress for things like testing with LLMs to see if we can get consistent answers. Maybe using LLMs for preliminary ontology expansion, especially for new controlled vocabularies. And we're adding more benchmarks as well. So that is where we are. And I think I have a few minutes left to take a few questions.
Yes. Wonderful. Wow. The big wow was partially answered towards the end by Elisa. I'm taking the liberty of asking a first question so that others who have similar questions will get an overview answer. First, I was thinking that IDMP and FIBO are two different things. One
are.
is dependent on medical products primarily, and the standards bodies that regulate that product, namely the medicine and side effects. And the other area is purely a financial.
Uh-oh, I'm not hearing you, Ravi.
Oh,
Can you repeat that last part? Ken, is it my internet or is it
We might, oh, he's back.
okay. So,
Ravi, we lost you for a while.
oh, okay, sorry. I just was saying these are two different uh, domains and different kinds of creatures. So, but there was one diagram that you showed, which is probably derived from BPMN, which showed that, and GitHub occurred in that.
Yeah,
In
that is a
diagram,
BPMN.
that
Corey Cassidy.
diagram showed me that it is a pattern which fits both these types of ontologies that's so wonderfully described by you. Thank you.
So
Now
that
with
is a
that,
BPMN model. Corey Cassidy created it
oh,
originally, and we've been editing it as we go.
and
But yeah.
Corey has been with us last couple of weeks, but today we don't have Corey, we don't have Mike Bennett for some
Mhm.
reason. So sorry, I interjected, but now I have in the queue the following people: Paul Tyson, uh, Todd Schneider, then Mark Underwood, then Nancy, and finally John and Ravi. John So
Okay.
and
So who are you starting with?
Paul. Paul Tyson.
Okay.
Paul, go ahead. Are you there? Paul is not there. Then we'll go to Todd.
Okay, yeah, I'm here. One question that I had was the version of logic that is supported for ontology definitions. The object management group, for example, supports full common logic, all the facilities of common logic plus other versions of logic for specifying the details of ontology. So what version of logic does your company's technology support?
So first, EDM Council is an industry consortium, not so much a company, but mainly OWL. But for the IOF project, and Ravi mentioned Todd Schneider is teed up. There's also First Order, and I'm not sure if the notation they're using is precisely common logic or what it is, but we have used some tools to try to test the axioms that are written in first order logic, and I don't remember what reasoner
Okay.
Pavel added on to do that, but the whole idea was to be able to take that logic and test it as well to make sure that whatever is happening inside of the IOF axioms is consistent at any rate.
Okay, well, the
Very good.
object
Very good.
management group does have implementations of very powerful tools
Yep.
for representing things, and there are many companies and uh, government agencies that also require those ontologies to have that support. So
Right.
it's essential to
Yes, yes.
support that.
Yep.
Certainly, John. That is what we also told in the introduction to Elisa's work. It has been at least a decade I have known her in OMG. And you are right. And it does use all those standards that you mentioned. Todd, you have a question?
Well, wait, before you finish there, Ravi, just to let you know, John, I've just recently taken over being co-chair of the Dole standard because
Very good.
the Till and Fabian are no longer OMG members because they couldn't get the backing from their universities. So if you have fixes that you would like added to the Dole standard, please let me know.
Okay, well, our company does support full common logic, and we have been using that as a very important for doing really rich, complex kind of applications.
I'm sure. So if there's something about the Dole standard that you need fixed, we are working to integrate some of these patterns with the Dole ontology, but if there's something else that you need, you know who to call.
Then what do you mean by DOL?
So it's distributed
Ontology.
ontology,
Language.
model,
Language.
and something else, specification language. And
Distributed
it,
ontology language.
yeah, allows you to represent or map content across many of those languages. And there's an implementation that I'm familiar with from Germany called HETS, which runs in common logic. And you can actually take an ontology and map it to another one, or you can translate it to another language and so forth. And it's pretty cool. And it's really comprehensive. I haven't played with it recently, but John may have. It's very cool.
Great. How about Paul? Is he back? If he's not, then what about Leslie?
Hi, Lisa. Nice to see you.
Lisa, sorry.
Wow, it's been so long since I've
Yes, it
seen
has.
you. I
It
have the
has.
same email address. You should send me
So do I,
yours.
actually.
Okay.
Here's the video.
Oh, very nice. Lovely to see you.
Yes. So it's great to catch up and see what you've been up to. And I'm very impressed. And I love the practicality and the real world interactions with institutions that have demanding requirements.
Thank
So,
you.
yes, I recall always having trouble on the requirements side with inverse relations, the semantics of inverse relations and triadic relations. And what we usually ended up doing was morphing the collection of triadic relations into an event. And then you have a mess because you're introducing a time dimension into your data. So I wonder how if you've confronted that and how you handled it.
So it depends, as you might have guessed.
Yes.
And by the way, some of the patterns in the Commons library will look very familiar to you with definitions from ISO 11179.
Yay.
Things like identifiers and their relationship to the schemes that they correspond with.
Yeah.
And we've expanded that further to add context and structured identifiers and so on and so forth. But anyway, we have one pattern that we describe as sort of a pattern for representing a state of affairs, something that holds for a given period of time. And there are players related to that pattern. And so what we've done that for really is for counterparty relationships for contracts and for ownership, control, beneficial ownership, also affiliation, also for investigating for a given entity playing a role of a counterparty. So for example, some LLC pulling at the edge of the sweater to figure out if the players involved in that LLC, oh, by the way, have also launched 17 other LLCs. And if large banks like B of A or Wells Fargo might have lent money to each of them independently, not knowing they're lending money to each of them independently and then happen to be the same person. So, and we just submitted a proposal to DARPA to look at anti-money laundering because we think some of those patterns also support that. So for that kind of thing, we can add the concept of the period of time for which something holds, which includes authorization or the ability to validate a particular identifier, for example, that was minted on a certain date and where they've renewed their validation over time. So for the Global LEI Foundation's legal entity identifiers, we can do that. Things like that. But we don't do at least in the two big projects I'm involved in, we haven't done huge time series or what I would describe as streaming reasoning kinds of problems. We have not addressed any of that, which is even more complicated, as you know.
Yeah, every once in a while I look at Analyst's notebook to see whether they've succeeded in connecting the event modeling with the relationship modeling, and not yet.
Not yet. There is a new standard coming out of OMG for pedigree and provenance, because the Provo ontology at W3C only does half. And we care about things for supply chain or for other purposes related to chain of custody, chain of ownership, that kind of thing, which is not represented properly in Provo. So the guys that worked on that came out of the National Archives, and there is an early version published, but the ontology needs to be fixed. So that is coming.
Okay, thank you.
Even I might wonderful. For Provo, it is also important to include the batch mixing or the packaging traces that you described in your talk, Elisa.
So I will, I'll drop my email in the chat.
Please. And Todd, you have your hand up. I have a
Nancy,
couple of
please
questions.
grab it.
Yeah. Todd, go ahead.
Are you ready, Elisa?
I am.
Yeah.
Hey, Elisa, your talk seemed to be focused strongly towards software and not too much on actual ontology analysis. So in your work, how has the extensibility of ontologies been supported? i.e., how do you not paint yourself into a corner too quickly?
So one of the reasons I focused on the process and on the infrastructure required is because that question you just asked takes a lot longer to answer. So let's see. One of the things we do, well, for maintenance purposes, we always follow DL safe rules. I don't know if you've read the paper. It was Uli Sattler and Ian Horrocks, and Uli, I think, was one of the leads. Anyway, following rules that say you can loosen constraints but not tighten them. You can never delete anything, although we actually do delete stuff, but we deprecate it for some number of quarters, up to a year in 5.0, for example. And then we warn people 3 times that we're gonna delete it before we do. Things like that help with managing change. But in terms of extensions, one of the reasons we have that collaborative framework is so that if somebody adds something in some direction or another, we at least test if it's consistent with everything else. And that's been a critical piece. And so another piece, and another piece is we avoid certain constructs. So, for example, we actually rule out, and you get an error, at least in 5.0 and IDMP. I don't know if this one is implemented for IOF. If you use min1 cardinality, we've said, no, you must use some values from, you may not use min1. And the reason for that is reasoning efficiency, but also implementation efficiency. So there are some rules like that we force people to follow so that your ontology isn't as tightly wound up. And so we try to avoid a lot of cardinality constraints unless it's totally required, like for a bilateral contract, you have to have 2 parties. But otherwise, we try to minimize that. And there are other things like that that we've implemented in order to improve efficiency. And we throw an error if you do any of those things. So
okay, yeah, sounds reasonable. Now, you mentioned earlier in your talk about inconsistent natural language definitions. And I am a big proponent of that's the starting point, if you like. How do you reconcile the different, I don't know, opinions or different natural language definitions that may occur in either standards or from large organizations? if you're UBS, if you're Chase, and they
Yeah.
have different definitions of things, how do you mitigate that?
Well, so
Have it out in the back with baseball bats?
eventually, but not at first. So I did a project with FIBO for a bank called Nordea in Denmark and Sweden. And they had 11 different definitions for the term nominal amount. Nominal amount is the face value of a contract, period, end of story. That is what it is. However, at Nordea, which was built up by M&A activity, they had different systems whose definitions were slightly different, some of them wrong. And part of that was because the bank was distributed across 7 or 8 countries, each of which spoke a different natural language, none of which was English, but they were using English as the lingua franca of the bank. So terms get overloaded in various interesting ways when you're misusing the language that you claim is the language of the bank. So that was one issue. But another one was they had different software systems that implemented things slightly differently. And I will tell you that data types are a problem and have been a problem for the last 50, 60 years. They're still a problem. And so the challenge there turned out to be finding out what was needed for the regulatory reporting use cases we had and focusing on that, and then using ISO 11404 to look at the definitions of those data types to see how well they complied with the ISO standard and whether or not we could narrow the gap by leveraging ISO 11404. And then there are, everybody puts up their fists and says it's my data type or the highway kind of a thing. But in some cases, we created a higher level concept where you could have properties in subclasses with different data types.
Very detailed work, but finally, you have shown us
Thank you.
there is a process of harmonization and alignment. These are two
It's hard.
key.
It's not consistent. And one of the things in the ISO IDMP land that was a problem and is still a problem is that you have 5 standards you have to adhere to for regulatory reporting, and they have 4 different definitions of dose form. And dose form is one of the things you're trying to standardize. So then there's no choice. You have to get the subject matter experts in the room, including the regulators who wrote these reports, and say, okay, what is the definition? Because this is supposed to be consistent across these ISO standards, and it is not. So we have a whole working group in the ISO TC215 that's going back and taking definitions that are used across multiple standards and using natural language processing to pull them all out and then say, okay, which one is correct and can we harmonize them? And that work's going on now. So it's, but it was the ontology that said, hey, these 2 are different. What do you want me to do? So that was the impetus for that. And so it's a process. Sometimes you can use rules of thumb to normalize. Sometimes you can make them policies and force people to normalize. Sometimes it takes getting people in the room and watching the fur fly.
Yes, thank you, Elisa. Very many things are being answered. I want to continue. I will give the floor to John for 1 minute, but before that, I have a question. You gave us very concrete examples in IDMP. What is that kind of client list for FIBO now and how it is growing?
Oh boy. Okay. So the challenge with FIBO and the challenge actually with IDMP over time, stakeholders for IDMP are people that are paying, right? So I know who they are. For FIBO, which has been the whole time has been open source, God only knows who's using it. I find out in odd ways that people are using it. I go to a concert, I go to a local meetup, I go to a conference, whatever it is, and people are saying, wait, you're the FIBO person. And yeah, we're using 5.0. I mean, it's like that. I find out in very odd, ad hoc, and somewhat serendipitous ways who's using it. But we know that the FDIC has downloaded it and installed it and are using it together with other things as the basis for an enterprise glossary effort, and they're looking at it for other use cases. We know that people working on the Financial Data Transparency Act have at least looked at it, and some of them, like the Federal Reserve, have downloaded it and are playing with it again. We know that a number of banks, B of A, Wells, UBS, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, a bunch of them have used it at some point. I don't know if they still are, because I only hear from them once in a blue moon. We know that there are other banks that are mid-sized banks like Huntington that are starting to use it. We know that there are other folks doing private equity, private credit, like one of them is BTD, BDT, MSD. I forget which order those initials go in, but anyway, they are a family run firm that used to do investment. Half of the firm used to be the investment arm for Michael Dell of Dell Computers. The other half, I forget where they came from, but they're now merged and they're an investment bank. And so some of their issues are a little more creative than the issues you would find at a big bank like Wells Fargo. Oh, and JP Morgan Chase uses it. BNY Mellon. A lot of big banks have implemented it. I just don't know for what use case or what the status is.
That's wonderful. And it's less controlled access compared to those for pharma. So I understand that you can't know everyone who is using it. But thank you for that answer. And John, a brief one, and then maybe, only person I have not asked is, I think, Mark Underwood, unless Mark has no questions. John, please
Okay.
go ahead.
Yes. One of the points I'd like to make is the solution that we've implemented, or my colleagues implemented at IBM many years ago, but in those days that was required a lot more computation. But today, this is a thing that several companies, including ours, is implementing, and that is using the standard first-order logic, or especially the version that's used for theorem proving, the TP. Thousands of problems of theorem proving use that notation. And the idea is that all of the official specifications are specified in that logic or some subset of it, which includes OWL as a tiny little subset. But the point is that that is the official. And then for natural language processing, what you do is say that the official definition of any natural language is its translation to that logic. And you can't assume that people will normally use that subset. So what you do is you allow them to type anything they want to in their own language, any language it can be, and that's translated into the official logic. And then what happens is that you get an echo back, and the echo that comes back says, is this what you mean? And that echo is always an exact translation of the formal logic. So the formal logic is always the official standard, and you always have a way of communicating in your natural language. And in fact, you can enter it in, say, English and have it come out in Russian, or enter it in Spanish and have it come out in Portuguese. The point is that the official standard is always logic, and it's absolutely precise. And then for communication with people, you allow them to talk or speak or type in any language they prefer. It gets mapped into logic, and then it can come back in an official precise version in whatever language you want it to come out as. And then you always get that echo and says, is this what you mean? And then when you say yes or push the button, then that is the version that gets processed. And that gives you absolute certainty, absolute precision. With a natural language front end, and anybody can use their own private language, whatever language they prefer, can be used as input, but the standard is always logic, and it's a superset of OWL. It's a superset of whatever other things people use.
Thank you, John. Well articulated. Elisa?
So one of the reasons that for these projects we chose OWL was computational efficiency and the ability to map it directly to the backend resources without too much trouble. And in part because we're using OWL as kind of a meta model for the content that we're describing. But
No,
SPV
OWL is not the most efficient. There are other languages that are more efficient than OWL.
I understand, but there are a lot of tools that can use OWL. So
Right, but if you use your own natural language, it doesn't matter what goes on underneath, because you always get your input and output in your language, your preferred language.
okay, well, feel free to send me some details and I will pass that on.
Okay, fine.
And thank you. Thank you, John. While John was talking, one thought came to me for the harmonization example you gave, Elisa, that perhaps you could force those different 10 or 11 terms for that one entity to be driven by logic. And also we can solve other such ambiguity problems using the prescription that kind of I heard John describe. Go through the mathematical logic of first order or whatever is the logic acceptable to all in a math sense and use it to converge different meanings by different communities into one common understanding. That's a very great long-term suggestion, and perhaps, Elisa, you will also find it useful somewhere.
Well, I'll certainly investigate. I mean, we're starting to look at a bunch of different tools because if you're using these very stringent ISO standards, I mean, there's a specific meaning and it's expressed in the standards, although as I mentioned, there are cases where it's ambiguous. But
Yes.
in that case, I work with the people that authored the ISO standards and also with subject matter experts in the pharma companies that have questions about those standards in order to build out the ontology. And that approach has served us well because then you get agreement across the critical people. And having that agreement has been very important for us to make progress. So we had one term which had to do with the chemical structure of a substance called moiety. And there were a bunch of arguments about whether we were actually talking about the active moiety or any moiety, or whether the definition of moiety was even right. And it went on for 13 months. I really cannot afford to spend 13 months analyzing one term. So the bottom line was we agreed to the definition that was in the ISO standard with a minor tweak. And then we sent it around to everyone and said, here's where we are agreeing for the moment. We can change it later, but this is what our preferred definition is as of this moment in time. And we're stopping. And at some point, you know, as the ontologist, you have to raise the flag and say, we're done here. We've been arguing about this for months and months and months, and we need to move on. And people kind of get that because you have to make progress pragmatically. And so if everyone gave their definition of moiety to a natural language engine that converted it to logic, the logic would be inconsistent across all those definitions, no doubt. And so then then you're acting as a mediator and hoping beyond hope that you can find somebody pragmatic in the group, which is where we landed. But you know, it can be hard. And as the ontologist, you have to take a step back and say, okay, I'm going to ask silly questions. I'm going to pretend that I know nothing. I'm going to get you guys to tell me what it is that I need to know. Even if I think I have some knowledge of a domain, I am not going to influence it. I want them to tell me, the subject matter experts, to say what exactly they mean so that I'm not interjecting some false perspective, as an LLM might, on what this concept means. And what it means in the context of the work that they are doing. And I think that's the critical thing, is it not just the meaning of this word in English or in Swahili, but its use in a given context by a set of subject matter experts who are trying to use it in the same way. And so in that sense, a general purpose translation engine is less effective than working with the subject matter experts to really tease it out. But that's just been my experience. I'm sure that other people have been very successful without doing that for other purposes.
Thank you, Elisa. It's a very, very enlightening and very, very engaging session for all of us. And you can see we've gone over half an hour over our limit, but I admire the fact that you have to contend with manufacturers like pharma companies, regulators like FDA and the European Union, and so on, and then also do a technology service. So thank you so much. And with my thanks to you for such a great session, I want to transfer this thanks to Ken. Ken was here briefly. I
He's
don't
here.
know where. Here he is. Okay, thank you, Ken. It is my thanks to you, Kalisa, and thank you for all for staying on and participating. We have a lot of questions on standards of OMG. Maybe you.
So thanks a lot for everything. It was a really very enlightening, very useful talk. Just, I'm thinking ahead to when we write our communique, and there's just so much material.
Well, just ask me.
It's overwhelming.
I might not have a lot of time, but just ask me. I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh,
Thanks so
thank
much. You're such a tremendous resource.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So, and thanks to everyone else for their participation. And with that, we will adjourn.
Just
Bye,
one
everyone.
input, Ken. Next week we have no meeting, and the week after that we have Terry Bollinger, who is going to talk to us about discrete and continuous nature of time and quantization. Thank you. And math, lot of math,
Yes, so
which is Ken's
I hope
subject.
to see all of you in 2 weeks, not next week. Have a little vacation for us. So bye, everyone.
Thank you.